If you're planning on falling asleep to this video, please hit the like button now and say hello in the comments. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough not to feel isolated. The area had no street lights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, as I had never smelled that before around that house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes. I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone's screen blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright, I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9-something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footsteps as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside of the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be placed in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped my bed over. I assumed in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise I had heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped. All the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pan, which the police said people often use to smoke meth, so they think he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day I called to have the door fixed and get motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else happened at that house, though. I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even practiced doing that at my new place, except now I go to a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. If you're enjoying the video, please gently click the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. My roommate was out of the house for the week, so I had the place to myself. It was spring break, so my college classes were out. I had no plans and really nothing I needed to do. On Monday, I was basically trapped inside due to a huge storm blowing through our city. This was common around this time of year, but it still always seemed worse every time. The trees always looked like they were going to blow away, and the house would shake and creak nonstop. Knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, I decided to just stay up. I turned on the Xbox and started up one of my video games and played for well over an hour, probably until 11 o'clock when the doorbell rang. I paused the game and got up, but then I remembered the whole storm situation. Who would be outside right now? I went over to the front door and looked through the peephole, but nothing. I opened the door. The wind and water hit me right away, but when I looked around, I didn't see anyone. I closed the door and thought maybe the wind had somehow rung the doorbell. I don't know, it sounds dumb now, but what was I supposed to think? I went back to my game, but only a couple minutes later, I heard a huge crash in the backyard, stuff tumbling over and breaking. I immediately knew it was our patio furniture and ran over to the back door. Everything was scattered around the yard, blowing around in the wind. I quickly put on my shoes and went outside, pushing each piece of furniture up against the back of the house. The wind was so heavy it would even hurt sometimes when the water would hit my face. I was rushing, going as fast as I could until I saw someone. They were standing at the edge of the backyard, watching me. I looked back at them for a moment, but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran inside to escape the rain. I looked out the back door as I dried off, but the person was gone. Between that and the doorbell ringing, I was a little bit nervous. I sat in the living room this time, just scrolling on my phone because I was tired of being interrupted. After a while, I struggled to keep my eyes open. I got a blanket and laid down on the couch. I didn't feel like going upstairs, and the storm was much louder up there. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off and fell asleep. A few hours later, still well into the night, I woke up from a sudden burst of heavy wind outside, shaking the house. I pulled the blanket to the side and sat up, moving my feet to the floor as I prepared to go check if the furniture outside was still there. But just when my feet touched the floor, they were soaked. It woke me up immediately. I looked down and saw a puddle on the ground right next to the couch. Then I saw another, leading in a line across the floor. Inside the puddles were faint muddy shoe prints. I stood up and ran to the corner of the room, heart beating rapidly in my chest. After a minute of hearing nothing but the wind outside, I slowly followed the shoe prints. They led all throughout the house, upstairs and down, but I could clearly tell that they entered through the back door, which I had stupidly forgotten to lock in the rush of getting out of the rain. I locked it and pulled my phone out to call 911, but then the thought crept into my mind, what if they're still inside? I stayed quiet and moved into the corner of the house where I felt the most hidden. I waited in silence for them to arrive. When they did, they took a look around, seeing everything I saw, but nothing more. They told me it seems like a personal attack because nothing was missing, and they were clearly focused on my house in particular. However, they walked right up to me while I was sleeping and seemingly did nothing but watch me, which is super creepy but doesn't make much sense. If they wanted to do something to me, they would have done it at that moment. After some thought, this had led me to believe that whoever it was had actually come from my roommates. They saw me, then looked around the whole house, and then left, doing absolutely nothing. So if this was a personal attack and my roommate was there, I think things may have gone a lot worse than they had. I lived with my older brother for about 4 years after I finished school. We shared rent on an apartment together since neither of us could afford anything on our own. But during the 4th year, my brother started making better money, and he planned to move out once the lease came to an end. I wasn't making a lot, so I knew I couldn't afford to pay for the apartment alone. I looked around online for a roommate for a few months, but decided to move out as well and find a cheaper place. I searched until the last month of our lease at the apartment. My brother had basically moved everything out already, and there was a lot of pressure on me to find somewhere quick. But with my extremely low budget, it was hard. Eventually, I stumbled across a listing posted by a homeowner renting out a room in their house. The man's name was Evan. I sent him a text to let him know I was interested, then kept searching. He responded within a few minutes. We scheduled a time to call later in the day, and when we did, he explained all the details. He said he lived alone in the house and was renting out his spare bedroom, but I'd be able to use all the other rooms in the house. It sounded great to me, so I agreed to it. A couple of weeks later, I packed everything in a U-Haul and drove down to the house. Between this time, we'd been texting and calling, and he sent me a bunch of pictures, but I hadn't had the chance to view it in person yet. I got there around noon, parking in the driveway. The house was definitely small, but it looked nice from the outside. Evan was standing in the garage, waving me over. He gave me a quick tour, then helped me unload all of my stuff into my room. Evan seemed like a regular man in his mid-30s, which was almost 10 years older than myself, but I didn't really mind. He didn't hold conversations very well, and was somewhat shy. Anyway, we finished moving everything inside, and I dropped the U-Haul off. I Ubered back to the house, and by then, it was almost 8 p.m., and I was really tired. Evan was on the couch, watching TV, so I told him I was going to bed early, and I went to my room. All in all, it seemed like a decent place, and I was happy with it. I unpacked some more, then set up my bed, and by 9 o'clock, I was finally ready to sleep. I walked over to my door to lock it and turn off the lights. But as I reached my hand out, I saw the knob on the door was empty. As in, there was no lock on it. Confused, I opened the door. The lock was on the outside of the door. I stepped into the living room and asked Evan why the bedroom door locked from the outside. He looked confused and said he never noticed that, but he would switch it around tomorrow. I shrugged and said okay, then went back to my room. I was tired and not too worried about it, but it was definitely an odd find. I got in bed and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I heard someone moving around in the kitchen, which I assumed was just Evan getting water or something. I closed my eyes again. A minute later, I heard him walking back down the hallway, but as he was passing my room, he stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the door. He was standing out there quietly for maybe 15 seconds before I heard a click. He locked my door. My stomach dropped, and I felt my face go cold as Evan walked down to his room. As soon as I heard his bedroom door shut, I got up quietly and went over to the door. I tried the handle, and it wouldn't budge. I stood in shock for a few seconds, coming to the reality that this man I just met has now locked me in a room. My fear started to turn into anger, and I called out for Evan, telling him to open the door. It only took a second before I heard Evan run out of his room and over to my door. I heard him place his hand on the door, but he paused for a few seconds before he unlocked it. I swung the door open right away. What the hell was that? I confronted him. Evan was stumbling over his words, saying he just wanted to make sure he was safe because he didn't know me well enough. I understood that concern, but locking someone in a room was not a smart way to go about it. I told him that I was going to pack up and leave in the morning. I stayed up all night on the couch in the living room, waiting for the U-Haul store to open at 9 o'clock. I looked into the hallway, seeing Evan's bedroom door was still closed, hopefully meaning he was still asleep. Then I drove straight there and drove the U-Haul back to the house. When I went inside, Evan's bedroom door was open. "Evan?" I called out. I walked over to his room and peeked my head inside. His room was empty. I moved my eyes around the room in disbelief, seeing as things were only getting weirder. I backed out and got straight to moving my stuff. I powered through 2 hours of moving boxes and taking apart my bed. I only had 2 boxes left, and I ran inside and picked up another, then rushed to the front door until Evan appeared in the doorway. "Move," I said. He stared at me emotionless. After a few seconds, he stepped aside. I hurried past him and shoved the box in the U-Haul. The last box was half full of random food I kept from my old pantry at the apartment. I decided to just leave it. Evan was freaking me out, and I wanted to get away from him as soon as possible. I started closing the back of the U-Haul before Evan interrupted. "You forgot this." He held out the last box. "Oh yeah, thanks." I grabbed it from him and climbed back into the truck. I felt him watching me as I stacked the box, and when I turned, he had his hand on the door. He started pulling it down, trying to close me in. I was able to stop him before the door was even halfway down. I shoved him to the ground, but he got up and ran. Not into the house, but off into the trees, away from the property. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't care. I quickly shut the back door and drove away. My brother was nice enough to let me stay with him until I found a new place. I don't know what happened at that house, or what would have happened, but there was definitely something very wrong going on. This all happened roughly around 4 years ago, but the experience has haunted me almost every single day since it happened. I'll start off by saying that at the time I was pretty young. I was single and very keen to have my first experience with someone. I spent a while looking through dating apps, talking to a few people, until I finally came across a guy who seemed interesting. We had a lot of things in common, so I thought it would be a good idea to meet up with him since we had been talking for almost a month. Now, even though I was only young, I wasn't naive or stupid. I was, and still am, a very cautious and paranoid person. But for some reason, I made what possibly could have been one of the worst decisions of my life. I invited him to come spend the night at my place. My parents were away for the weekend and I had the place to myself, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity for him to come over. He lived around 3 hours away from my place, yet he was eager and almost desperate to visit. So he set off as soon as he finished work, which was around 11 a.m. The whole time he was driving to my place, I had the sickening sense of impending doom. Almost as if something was going to go very, very wrong. I almost texted him multiple times to tell him that I wasn't interested anymore, but I hesitated as he was only 10 minutes away by this point. I jumped up as I heard his car pull up, and I expected to be greeted by a smile once I opened the door. But he pushed his way through, and continued to stare at me blankly, all whilst my 2 French bulldogs snarled and growled at him, which they never do to anyone. Things instantly seemed extremely odd. He followed me quickly to my bedroom and didn't waste any time in aggressively undressing me. I hesitantly went along with it, as this was my first experience with someone. He was almost 6 years older than me, so I was pretty tense. Fast forward to a couple of hours later, he suddenly asked me if he could sleep in my room, which confused me as it was only 5 p.m. But I told him it was fine, and I would continue to watch movies by myself downstairs. After about an hour, I heard what sounded like furniture being moved around, and the sound of him talking. So I made my way upstairs and opened my door, only to find him crouching in the middle of my room and breathing extremely heavily. When I asked if he was okay, he motioned for me to get on the bed. He sat me on his lap and proceeded to place a blindfold over my eyes, putting his hands around my neck lightly. I was already feeling extremely uncomfortable, and it worsened as he tightened his grip around my throat. He asked, "Does anyone know I'm here? Do your friends know who I am and what I look like?" I instantly answered, saying that my sister and friends knew he was here. This was a complete lie because I don't have a sister, and my friends were unaware, but something inside of me forced me to say it. After minutes of awkward silence, he stood up to gather his things. I noticed that in his backpack, he had tape, rope, and handcuffs. At first, it didn't concern me as I knew he was into that stuff, but looking back, I think it was intended for something much worse. All of a sudden he said, "I think I'm going to head home. I have a long drive, and I'm rather tired." I didn't hesitate to let him out of my door because I was already extremely uncomfortable. As he left, he failed to even look at me or say goodbye. He raced off down the street as soon as he got into his car. I ran back to my room to see if he had left anything, because he'd left in a hurry. I found a note on my desk with the words, "Being nice is what saved you." At the time, I had no idea what the note meant. Now that I think about it, I seriously think that he had very ill intentions toward me. I'm still angry at myself for letting a stranger into my home, which was obviously a big mistake. I immediately blocked him on all of my social media. I am just so lucky that I made it out alive. All I know is that he is now somewhere back in America. I don't really know why he was living in the UK at the time that I met him, but all I can say now is that I am glad that he is many miles away from me. About 10 years ago, I lived on my own and didn't have much company. I was quite depressed at the time after losing my girlfriend to a drunk driver. I was enjoying a beer and watching the sunset on the back porch when I saw a large, scruffy man emerging from the tree line. My heart skipped a beat as he stumbled towards my house in a menacing way. Living alone, I often used my backyard for target practice. And at that moment, I was immensely grateful for it. Instinctively, I rushed to bolt all the doors while frantically dialing the police. What I didn't know was that this intruder had broken in the day before through a basement window and had spent the night squatting there. He had left the basement door unlocked, and at this point, he'd made his way inside the house and was making his way up the stairs towards me. I gripped my rifle, aiming at the approaching man as he descended the hallway. I shouted at him, ordering him to stop and get on the ground, but he just kept walking towards me. I fired the first round, loaded with rock salt, but he showed no reaction. I quickly followed with a rubber bullet to the chest. Yet the drugged-up guy, who was clearly out of his mind, continued advancing. This guy was huge, at least twice my size, and I realized that whatever drugs he had in his body were going to push him through any pain that a rubber bullet would inflict. He was backing me into a corner. I desperately begged him to stop and warned him what would happen, but he just moaned at me like a zombie and shouted, "Shoot! Do it!" Then he lunged towards me. I took my third shot. I can't recall whether it was buckshot or a slug, but it left a gaping hole in his chest. It barely even slowed him down. He kept coming, and in a frenzied struggle, he wrestled me to the ground. He was moaning and coughing up blood. Suddenly, he grabbed my face with both of his massive hands and started squeezing my head. It was utterly terrifying. I could feel him trying to burst my skull open like a balloon. I don't know how long it actually lasted, but it felt like forever. Eventually, the injury finally caught up with him, and he died on top of me. I was laying with him crushing me for a few minutes. My energy was completely drained, and I could barely breathe with his weight on top of me. His body was pushing my rifle into my chest, and it was causing me serious pain when I tilted his body to the side. I was completely drenched in his blood, and I can still remember the overwhelming smell. I'd completely forgotten that I was still on the phone with the operator, who had heard our entire exchange, which more or less amounted to me pleading, "Stop, or I'll shoot," and the man menacingly taunting. The police arrived soon after, and the incident made it to the local papers. There was a criminal investigation, but eventually, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. It turned out that the intruder was wanted for murder of an elderly couple in Baltimore and had somehow made his way 50 miles up the road into a rural area.